Good evening. Tonight I am going to be discussing family violence and child abuse. To start, I will give you a little bit of a background um, about what exactly child abuse is. Um, Child abuse occurs when someone inflicts serious emotional or physical harm on a child. Um, it is difficult to create a list of exactly what child abuse is. There are many factors that go into it, and um, there's no way to, list every single thing that would constitute child abuse. So even from state to state, it can vary. But in general, there are four main types of abuse: physical, sexual, neglect, and abandonment, and emotional or psychological abuse. Um, just to give some general examples, um, physical abuse includes hitting, kicking, shaking a child, burning a child, throwing an object at a child, or starving a child. Anything that is done to physically harm a child intentionally would be considered physical abuse. Sexual abuse, while there's the very obvious forms such as raping or forcing a child to commit sexual acts, there are also things such as showing a child something pornographic, or showing them your genitals, or making them pose for a pornographic picture. All of these things are also sexual abuse. Again, this can take shape in many different forms. This is just a brief listing. Neglect and abandonment. That's any time that you are intentionally, or even not intentionally, depriving your child of something. So withholding food, depriving them warmth, not providing them medical care, locking them in a confined space, or abandonment, such as leaving them alone for long periods of time. Um, Lastly, the emotional or psychological abuse. This is probably most difficult to define, because this this is things such as threatening a child, terrorizing them, ignoring them, withholding love and support from a child. So again, this is where it can get tricky, because um, what some people consider just parenting, or a different parenting technique, others may consider emotional or psychological abuse. Um, what is family violence? So this is also known as domestic violence, probably more commonly. Family violence is a pattern of intentionally violent or controlling behavior used by a family member or intimate partner of a person. This is done to gain control or power during and or after a relationship, so you don't have to be in a relationship with someone to be a victim of family violence. Examples of this include physical abuse, controlling a person's schedule, interfering with their access to a telephone, destruction of property, and emotional abuse. So name calling, belittling, demeaning. Some scary statistics about child abuse and family violence. Nearly 1 million cases are reported of child abuse in the United States every year. Now, this is just what's being reported. As we know and will further discuss, oftentimes both child abuse and domestic violence are not reported. It's very underreported. In 2015, an estimated 1,670 children died as a result of child abuse and neglect. That's a staggering number. children that lost their lives to child abuse and neglect. Uh, Neglect is the most common form of abuse. Many children suffer from multiple forms, so some may experience emotional abuse and neglect, or physical abuse and neglect, but nearly 3/4 of all children that were abused were neglected. 90% of abusers are related to the child in some way. So whether it's a parent or a family member, whether immediate or not, there is 90% of the time they are related to the child. Some statistics about family violence: every 9 seconds a woman is beaten or assaulted. This was probably the most shocking to me. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women in the United States. This is more than muggings, rapes, and car accidents combined. Nearly 8 million days of paid work are missed by victims of domestic violence per year. That is equivalent to 32,000 full-time jobs. So again, a staggering number, a staggering amount of people being affected by domestic violence. So one of the biggest questions that people have is, why are victims hesitant to report abuse? I think people that are not in or have never been in this type of situation, they wonder, why don't they just leave? Or why are they dealing with that? Why didn't they tell someone? The most common reason that victims do not report abuse is fear. So fear of retaliation, fear of breaking up their family, fear of what will happen to them, whether they are a child, fearful that they'll be removed from the home, or fearful that they'll break up their family and, be separated. Fear is the most common reason. Other things that play a part are cultural considerations, immigration status, or a lack of outside resources. So, sometimes those who are here in the country undocumented or illegally, or those who moved here from another country, even if it was legally, and they are documented, because of the culture they came from, where maybe it's more acceptable or even expected that a husband would hit his wife or his children. It definitely plays a part in why people are reporting or not reporting abuse. And another really big thing is the way that the victims feel emotionally after, whether it be physical abuse, psychological abuse. These types of situations cause shame and embarrassment. A lot of times the victims blame themselves. So it's very hard for them to come forward and admit what has been going on. Especially for children that are being abused, they may feel that they are protecting their other parent or their siblings if they don't report, or if they do report, then they feel maybe their siblings will begin to be abused, or kind of pay for it, quote unquote, for them reporting it. And lastly, a very difficult thing can be when the victims feel a sense of loyalty or attachment to their abusers. As I talked about earlier, 90% of abusers are related to their victim. So a child's loyalty and attachment to their mother or their father or their uncle or grandmother, or anyone that they've grown up with and have an attachment to, it can be very hard for them to report something that someone they care about so much is doing to them. Some of the effects of child abuse on children. So the short-term effects, obviously there are the physical, bruises, broken bones, the injuries that can result, and the psychological and behavioral issues that can take place, such as isolation, fear, sadness, anger. So a lot of times we'll see children begin to isolate themselves or begin acting out, maybe at school or in other like safe settings where they are exhibiting some of those symptoms because of what they're going through at home. But the long-term effects of abuse, really, they can have effects on these children until they're well into their adulthood. So physically, child abuse can cause impaired brain development, and this has consequences as far as their cognition, their language development, academics, and as I'll discuss in further detail, their mental health illnesses. They also, studies have shown that children that are abused tend to overall have poor health as they age. So they're more likely to have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, obesity. There are a whole bunch of different health disorders that adults can have if they were abused as children. Psychologically, long-term effects include low self-esteem, relationship issues, like I said, the increased risk for mental health illnesses. So there is a link between borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety in children that were abused as opposed to those who were not. Disruption of emotion regulation. As I discussed earlier, neglect is the most common type of child abuse, and this is associated with antisocial behaviors, borderline personality disorder, attachment issues, aggression, and inappropriate modeling of adult behaviors. So while it's the most common, it does have some pretty significant long-term effects. As you can see, really it can create some really difficult behaviors that would inhibit an individual's ability to create loving, secure attachments and relationships. Behaviorally, children that are abused are much more likely to engage in juvenile delinquency and crime as adults. As you can see, they are actually 9 times more likely. 9 times. So that's huge. A child being abused has a huge impact on their likelihood of getting involved in crime. Alcohol and drug abuse, much more likely to become addicted to drugs or engage in alcoholism type behaviors. And lastly, there is a correlation between children that were abused and the likelihood that they will engage in abusive behavior. So either in later on in relationships or when they become parents towards their children. So lastly, we'll just take a quick look at different resources that are available to reduce child and domestic abuse. And fortunately, there are a ton of resources. So while I couldn't name every possible nonprofit organization and government agency and of course, regular resources such as, schools and teachers and doctors and nurses and hospitals. I mean, there's so many people that are able and trained to help. However, I'm just going to focus on those that are focusing on reducing child and domestic abuse. So the most important strategy, I think, for reducing abuse of any kind is prevention. So educational resources are a great way to do this. They are able to identify different groups that have increased risk factors, and then they're able to provide education and support to those groups. An example of this is the National Children's Alliance, which I used throughout the presentation. They had a lot of great information, and they're the National Association for Children Advocacy Centers, which are also a crucial part of helping in child abuse cases. The advocacy centers are where children are brought after being removed from abusive situations. So it allows them to go to one safe place. They meet with one interviewer who discusses, who's trained specifically in what to ask, and they then advocate for that child. So through the healthcare system, through the judicial system, foster system, whatever the child goes through from that point on, there's this advocacy center that kind of takes that child in and speaks for them, and rather than them kind of being sent to the hospital and then being picked up by a social worker and then to the the foster family, there's kind of this one central place who is advocating on their behalf. So they do really great things, and there's a ton of these children advocacy centers all over the country. But the National Children's Alliance also provides prevention training and information, and in 2016 they provided over 1.8 million individuals with child abuse prevention training. And again, there are a ton of nonprofits that are doing the same thing, and there are quite a few resources available. Lastly, where the law enforcement and government agencies come in, they're more essential in reducing abuse unfortunately once the abuse has occurred. So they usually become involved when they get a call of abuse or someone's very hurt because of abuse. This is when the police officers will come, and they're responsible for intervening in these cases and separating the abuser from the victim. So there was actually a research study done showing that when an individual, an abuser, is arrested and removed from the home, they are much less likely to come back into the home and abuse again. So that is kind of where the laws came in, that someone has to be arrested when there's a domestic violence case, that one of them has to be arrested. It's based on that study. So police officers play a very important role in reducing that, the amount of abuse. Lastly, government agencies, they play a little bit of a different role, multiple different roles, I should say. So they ensure that resources are available to victims. They conduct research on abuse, child and domestic abuse, to understand and better be able to prevent it. And they monitor child welfare services. So the federal government agencies are going to monitor the town and state, I should say the state welfare services. Just kind of a checks and balance and making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. An example of this is the Children's Bureau, which is an office of the Administration for Children and Families. That is a government agency with a budget of $8 billion a year. And they use that money to strengthen and protect children and families, and to ensure that every child has a family or family connection. Thank you so much for listening.